How did women, for hundreds of thousands of years, actually handle their periods before any of the products we now take completely for granted existed? Not did they cope, they obviously coped, or none of us would be sitting here watching this. The real question is how, and the answer is stranger, more resourceful, and more revealing about how ancient societies actually saw women than you'd probably guess. Let's start with the annoying part, at least for archaeologists. Menstruation barely shows up in the archaeological record at all. Moss, leaves, grass, softened inner bark, absorbent lichen, folded animal hide. These are the leading candidates for what Paleolithic and Neolithic women likely used based on what plant fibers and materials were available in a given region. And every single one of those materials rots. It breaks down in soil within years, sometimes months, long before any archaeologist ever shows up with a brush and a grid map, several thousand years too late. Here's the thing, nobody tells you about prehistoric research. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It just means the material didn't survive 15,000 years. Not that nothing was ever there to begin with. Some researchers have floated the idea that red ochre, the pigment showing up at Paleolithic sites across Europe and Africa, may have carried symbolic ties to blood and womanhood in some contexts. That idea stays speculative and unresolved, and it's worth saying that plainly, instead of pretending archaeology has this fully figured out. Sometimes the honest answer really is, we don't know yet. It's a strange thing to admit on a channel built around answering questions, but not every ancient mystery gets a tidy resolution. Some of them just sit there, waiting on evidence that may never survive long enough to arrive. So archaeologists do what they always do when the direct evidence quietly rots away. They look sideways at written records from cultures that came later and happened to leave something behind on purpose, which brings us to Egypt, and one very specific, very old medical document. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BC and now sitting in a university library in Leipzig, Germany, is one of the oldest surviving medical texts in the entire world. It contains remedies for dozens of ailments and a section specifically addressing menstrual irregularities and gynecological complaints treated as legitimate medical conditions worth writing down. That's worth sitting with for a second. Egyptian physicians weren't treating menstruation as a mystery or a curse, or something too shameful to name. They were treating it as biology, the same way they'd treat a stomach ailment or a broken bone. Compare that to how casually some modern doctors still dismiss period pain as probably nothing 4,000 years later, and ask yourself who actually made more progress here. The same papyrus also includes remedies for things like digestive problems, skin conditions, and parasites, all listed with the same matter-of-fact tone. Menstruation sat right there in the list, not in some separate hushed category of its own. You've probably heard the claim that ancient Egyptian women used softened papyrus rolled into an early tampon. It's repeated constantly online, but the honest version is that it traces back to later Greek writers describing Egypt, not to an Egyptian medical text itself. So treat that one as plausible folklore, not confirmed fact. Not every ancient claim gets to graduate into history, even the fun ones, but here's where it gets genuinely more complicated. Not every ancient culture treated menstruation with the same clinical respect Egypt seemed to. Head to ancient Greece, a few centuries later, and the tone shifts dramatically. The Hippocratic corpus, the foundational body of Greek medical writing from around the 5th century BC, developed a theory that the womb could physically wander around the body if it wasn't kept satisfied through regular menstruation or pregnancy. Yes, a wandering, dissatisfied uterus drifting through your organs like it's looking for a parking spot. Physicians taught this as established fact, serious credible medicine for centuries. The word hysteria comes from this exact idea. It traces back to the Greek word for uterus, hystera, because ancient physicians believed a huge range of unrelated symptoms traced back to the womb misbehaving. So what was it? Just bad biology misread by people without microscopes? Or something else layered on top of that? Something else. And here's the twist that actually matters, that same wandering womb idea didn't stay locked in antiquity either. 19th century European doctors were still diagnosing women with hysteria as a legitimate medical condition, over 2,000 years after the Hippocratic corpus first floated the theory. 2,000 years is an embarrassing amount of time to keep believing an organ can just relocate itself out of sheer dissatisfaction. By the time you get to Rome, the tone doesn't get more scientific, it gets stranger. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder wrote an entire encyclopedia called Natural History around 77 AD. In it, he claimed menstrual blood could sour wine, blunt razors, and kill entire hives of bees. He went further. Supposedly, it could dull the shine on ivory and even make crops wither if a woman simply walked through a field during her period. None of that is true, obviously, and modern agriculture would look very different if it were, but Pliny wasn't some random guy rambling in a tavern after too much of that wine he was so worried about souring. He was one of the most respected naturalists in the Roman world, and scholars cited his encyclopedia as a serious scientific reference for well over 1,000 years afterward. There's a bitter little irony here, too. Pliny reportedly died in 79 AD sailing toward Mount Vesuvius to observe the eruption up close, a curiosity that outpaced his own caution. A man that curious about volcanic ash still somehow decided crop-withering menstrual blood was the more urgent scientific mystery of his lifetime. Think about that for a second. A specific, physical, entirely imaginary danger attached to menstruating women, written down as established fact by one of history's most trusted scientific authorities, then copied and cited for generations. That's not folklore whispered at the edge of a village fire. That's institutional, textbook-level misinformation, and it's stuck around for centuries because nobody with enough authority ever pushed back. Here's where you'd expect the story to just quietly stall out on that grim note. Ancient women, enduring superstition, blood mythologized into something between a curse and a household hazard. But medicine didn't stay stuck there either. And this is the part most videos on this exact topic skip entirely. Jump forward to medieval Europe, to a collection of texts known as the Trotula, compiled in the Italian city of Salerno around the 12th century and traditionally associated with a female physician named Trotula. These texts cover menstrual disorders, fertility, and childbirth in direct, practical detail, offering actual treatment recommendations rather than warnings about ruined wine and dying bees. They even discuss absorbent cloth preparation and herbal remedies for painful periods, written in a tone closer to a working manual than a moral lecture. Around the same centuries, in the Islamic Golden Age, the physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century. It became one of the most influential medical textbooks in both the Islamic world and later Europe, translated into Latin and used in university medical training for centuries. It addressed menstrual cycles as a normal physiological process requiring real clinical attention, discussing cycle regularity and irregularity as diagnostic information, not moral judgment. Both the Trotula and the Canon of Medicine were taught in early European universities, including the medical school at Salerno itself, meaning students training to be physicians were reading actual clinical descriptions of menstruation centuries before anyone had a microscope. So the wandering womb and the crop-killing curse never fully disappeared. But alongside them, quietly, real clinical medicine kept trying to treat periods as exactly what they are. Biology? Now here's the part most videos on this topic skip entirely, and it might be the most interesting piece of the whole story. Because when anthropologists actually went and studied traditional societies, still living close to how humans lived for most of history, they found something the mythology completely missed. In 1996, anthropologist Beverly Strassman, then at the University of Michigan, published a landmark study in the journal American Anthropologist based on years of fieldwork with the Dogon people of Mali. The Dogon maintain a menstrual hut, a dedicated structure women use during their periods, and outsiders had long assumed this was purely about ritual impurity, basically a physical version of the same superstition Pliny wrote about 2,000 years earlier. Strassman's actual data told a different story. She found the huts functioned as a practical communal system, a reliable way to track fertility, coordinate labor, and manage a difficult biological reality without a single modern product involved. Women weren't being punished or hidden away in shame. They were using a shared space specifically built for exactly what their bodies were already doing in a community where that was simply understood, not whispered about behind closed hands. Strassman reportedly tracked hut usage directly, effectively turning attendance records into fertility data, which is either brilliant fieldwork or the most awkward research assistant job in anthropology. And here's something that genuinely surprises most people about that same study. Strassman's data also showed Dogon women menstruate far more often across a lifetime than most researchers had assumed natural fertility looked like historically. Modern scientists had spent decades assuming pregnancy and prolonged breastfeeding kept ancient women from menstruating anywhere near as often as women do in industrialized countries today. Strassman's actual fieldwork showed the real number was higher than that assumption, which meant menstrual huts weren't some rare, occasional inconvenience squeezed in once in a while. They were regular, expected, built-in infrastructure, a working part of how the whole village ran, not a taboo bolted on as an afterthought. It's a useful reminder. The outside interpretation of a custom, this must be about shame, and the real lived function of that same custom can be two completely different things, and it's not just the Dogon. Anthropologist Marjorie Shostak's fieldwork with the Jew Honzi people of the Kalahari, published in her 1981 book Nisa, describes women discussing menstruation openly as an ordinary fact of daily life, not a shameful secret requiring euphemism. Shostak's research was built on years of recorded interviews with a Jew Honzi woman named Nisa herself, which is a very different research method than a Roman senator theorizing about bees from a safe, dry distance. So you end up with two very different pictures existing at the exact same time throughout most of history. One where menstruation gets mythologized into something dangerous, wine-souring, crop-killing nonsense written by men who never once had to deal with it themselves. And another, quieter one, where women build practical, communal systems to handle a completely normal biological process, using whatever their environment and culture offered them. Both are true. Probably both, depending entirely on which society you're standing in and which written record happened to survive long enough for us to find it. Now, here's something that genuinely surprises most people about modern science too, because we didn't magically get this right the moment we invented microscopes. In 1971, psychologist Martha McClintock published a study in the journal Nature claiming that women living together, in her case at Wellesley College, gradually synchronized their menstrual cycles over time. It became famous almost instantly. It got a catchy name, menstrual synchrony, and it got repeated in textbooks, magazine articles, and casual conversation for decades afterward. Here's the problem. Later, larger studies using better tracking methods couldn't reliably reproduce the effect, and most researchers today treat menstrual synchrony as a statistical illusion rather than a real biological phenomenon. So even a fully modern, peer-reviewed, published in Nature claim about periods turned out to need serious revision decades later. The wandering womb had better company than you'd think. And modern products haven't exactly had a clean track record either, if we're being honest, instead of smug about it. In 1980, the CDC investigated a wave of toxic shock syndrome cases, a rare but serious bacterial illness linked specifically to a high-absorbency tampon brand called Rely, made by Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble pulled the product from shelves that same year. And the case is one reason tampon packaging still carries absorbency warnings printed right there on the box today. Even the modern version of this story, the one we like to think of as fully solved, needed a public health scare and a federal investigation to get sorted out properly. Modern pads and tampons feel inevitable now, like they've simply always existed in some form. They haven't, not even close. Disposable pads only became widely available in the 1920s, adapted from surplus cellulose bandage material that nurses had noticed worked unusually well for wound dressing during World War I. The modern tampon isn't much older. Physician Earl Haas patented a cardboard applicator design in 1929, which he later sold to the company that became Tampax. That's it. 100 years, give or take, out of roughly 200,000 years of women managing this exact same biological process with moss, hide, communal huts, and whatever quiet system their community trusted. And in a strange full-circle twist, reusable cloth pads and menstrual cups have quietly surged back into popularity in the last decade, marketed as new and sustainable, essentially reinventing methods that predate written history. Honestly, the part that sticks with me isn't the Pliny nonsense, even though it's the most quotable. It's how ordinary this whole subject was for most of human history, right up until certain people decided it needed to be a secret. Somewhere between the Dogon hut and the modern drugstore aisle, an entirely normal biological process picked up centuries of shame it never actually earned. Every stain history tried to mythologize into a curse, a contamination, a wandering organ, or a crop-killing hazard was never any of those things to begin with. It was just biology, doing exactly what it's always done, long before anyone with a papyrus scroll or an encyclopedia thought to write it down wrong.